we all know that you need to be finishing your seams on your sewing, but actually not finishing the raw edges of the fabric is one of the biggest mistakes that I see new sewers making. And it can be really hard because the most common seam finish is of course the overlock or the serger seam, but this requires a whole other machine. And when you're just beginning to sew, you probably don't have an overlocker or a serger. So in this video, I'm going to talk to you and show you 6 different seam finish methods that you can use that do not require an overlocker or a serger. Welcome back, my lovely ladies and gents. It's always a pleasure to see your smiling faces. If we're just meeting for the first time, my name is Evelyn Wood and I'm the creator of Vintage Sewing School. And at Vintage Sewing School and here we focus on vintage sewing techniques that can really help improve your dressmaking for modern day sewing. And one of those techniques is seam finishes. Now this is a skill that will take you a long way through your sewing. So being able to choose correct seam finishes for your project, and even then developing and making more couture and more beautiful seam finishes is actually the like almost the #1 way that you can make your sewing look so much more professional, is by using neat, nice seam finishes that are appropriate for your project. And when you're only just beginning to sew, you probably don't have this magical device that is called an overlocker or a serger. They are the same thing. I use the word overlocker, so FYI. Now it is the seam finish that you will find in 99% of the garments that you see in the shops is the overlock. And it is the most versatile, and I do recommend that if you're into sewing, you do perhaps look at making an investment and getting yourself an overlocker. But what do you do when you don't have one? Or you just want to try some more couture, more historical seam finishes to your garments. I have 6 different seam finishes for you that I'm going to show you and talk to you about so that you can decide which one you might want to investigate and perhaps try in your very next project. Just very quickly first, let's just talk about what is a seam finish, because there might be some of you that do not know. So a seam finish is the treatment that you give to the raw edges of the fabric past the seam line. So where you've stitched your seam and it's those raw fuzzy edges, you need to treat them in a way, finish them, so that they don't fray. Because if you don't, all of this will just keep fraying out and all of your hard work, all of your sewing will just disappear. So this is why you need a seam finish, and it makes it look pretty on the inside too. So the first one that we can do without an overlocker is actually the zigzag stitch. You're probably familiar with this one. But you can do this on your straight domestic machine. And now the zigzag stitch is actually a few levels and a few different ways that you can go about doing your zigzag. You can start with sort of the basic zigzag, and then you can sort of upgrade it, adding a straight little stitch and using an overcast foot and all sorts of things. I actually have this video here will show you a tutorial on how to actually do that, and that's the one that you really want to watch, and it's probably the most durable as well for when you're just starting out, is the zigzag stitch. Another seam finish that you can do is a French seam. Now French seams are quite popular. A lot of people, I think, look for them. Now my students actually in Vintage Sewing School have been enjoying trialing their French seams, because we just did a tutorial, I think last month, on how to do them. So basically a French seam is a little counterintuitive, because all the raw edges are actually encased inside the sort of seam that you create. So you actually sew them wrong sides together first, trim back your seam allowance, then fold it out right sides together and then sew down, and that creates your final seam of the garment. So that can be quite tricky, particularly when you're learning to sew, because you have to do wrong sides together, then right sides together, and getting the right amounts either way can be really quite challenging mathematically, and when you're not sort of used to seeing seam allowances and everything, it can be a bit tricky. So I wouldn't recommend doing them as a very beginner, but definitely French seams are something for nice, even sheer fabrics. It's used for quite a lot. So think chiffons, georgettes, organza, because it's fully encased and it just looks like a little strip from the outside when you see through it, and suits finer, you know, more delicate fabrics because it can get bulky if you use it in a thicker fabric. So that's French seams. Another one to try, and a very, very, actually all of these are really historical except the zigzag stitch. All of these were used pre-overlocker. So before the sort of, let's say maybe around the 50s when the overlocker became more commercially used. These are all the seam finishes that were used. This one I see on vintage garments a lot. So this is just a straight turn and stitch. So you sew your seam as normal, and then the actual edges are just very, very lightly rolled over and stitched down so that you end up with just stitch lines on the outside, and the raw edges are folded up underneath. So this is used a lot on vintage garments that I find, 50s and earlier. It is quite a nice, neat seam finish. It's easy to do for sure. In our modern day lives of using a washing machine though, you really still do have the raw edges over on the other side. So it may not be the best if you want to put this in the washing machine over and over again, because they are still actually raw edges there. They're just kind of turned over, but it will last quite a while. So that one is a nice one to try. You can do it open, you can do it closed. It does suit open probably the best. Now, next up is the pinking shear. So this is a very, very common one that I find on vintage garments again. So the pinking shear is this little edge that has the zigzags on there. It's cut with special pinking shear scissors, and they are for fabric, not just like craft ones. Make sure if you're going to try this, get the fabric ones. And it just cuts a little zigzags into the fabric. I also do talk more about this in this video here as well, about how you might be able to do the pinking shear edge too. So a lot of people do add, say, a straight little stitch along this as well, just to give it a bit more structure. Again, I wouldn't recommend this one for heavy washing use. This was more used when before washing machines and items were hand washed and very delicately treated and washed less. So it's more a treatment I would use for a delicate item, something sheer, something like that. And a loose weave, it's probably not going to be the best choice, but it is a really nice, easy finish that you can use. Another very historical seam finish that you might like to try is a felled seam. So a felled seam is actually very fast becoming my favorite, and it is a tutorial I'm working on for my students at Vintage Sewing School this month. So we'll be seeing a lot of felled seams coming through in my world very soon. So a felled seam is really, really nice. It is a beautiful couture finish, it can be. And it is a lot easier to sew than French seams, for example, because with a felled seam, you can sew your seam as normal, and then basically you trim back one side of the seam allowance and then fold the long side back over the other side so you enclose those raw edges in the little sort of seam casing that you make there. So you have then two choices. You can either hand sew that flap down, which is what I would do, or you can actually machine sew that down, and that's called a flat felled seam mostly. So that's what you see on men's shirts and heavy duty workwear, where it's got that extra row of stitching, and underneath the seam allowance seems to be all tucked up and under. That's called a flat felled seam. So you can do either or. I like the hand stitched one. It's a lot neater, you know, it gives a softer, more couture finish, and it's actually a little bit easier to adjust should you need to, because the hand stitches come out quite easy if you need to undo them, and then you can still fit the garment, fiddle around, just trim it back and then refell it down. So it's quite easy to work with, and if you need to make adjustments and alter things, it's really quite easy to use. So that's the felled seam. And then the last one here is the Hong Kong binding, or a bound seam. It's the same. So this is where you actually bind the seam here with usually bias binding. a bias tape, I should say, and you use it as a binding. So this is used quite commonly on either what's this one? An armhole seam. Maybe you've done French seams over everything else, but because it's quite curvy around through here, those seams don't really work so well, and so a bound seam works nice. This is also really commonly used on thicker fabrics like jackets and wools and really loose weave type fabrics like that. This is quite a nice seam. So it does make it quite bulky, of course, because you're adding so much more, even more fabric to there with the binding. So that's why you mostly use this for thicker, heavier fabrics. So something on a really light sheer fabric, it will just make the seam too stiff. You'll see this come through, and it just won't really work. So it's more for heavy duty fabrics. Can be open seams, can be closed seams, but that is your bound seam. So what seam finishes do I mostly use? Well, I mostly use an overlock seam. It is sort of the most common, and when you're refashioning, I like to replicate the stitches that are already there, and so that's using the overlocker, so it all blends in really nicely. But I must admit, of late, my very favorite is to actually do the felled seams and doing those by hand, of course, that final hand finish. I think gives just a beautiful look inside and out. It feels divine, it looks divine, it can still be altered if need be. So that's the kind of higher end one that I'm really working towards using more and more in my sewing. So what do you think? Do you have any other seam finish techniques that we should add to the list? Let me know. And let me know which ones of these that you use and which ones are you going to look at maybe upskilling yourself to and trying in your next sewing project to really continue to grow your sewing skills, as we all do. Leave that in the comments below. I do absolutely love reading all your comments, and if you really enjoyed this video and you actually know somebody else who is new to sewing and could really use a little bit of help and use this video, I would be so grateful if you would share it with them, because the more people that this word gets around, the more people will see sewing in this world, and that is what we want. Thank you very much for watching, and all the links are below to those other videos that I think that you'll really enjoy. And until next time, happy sewing. Bye.